The moment the paper hit the marble floor in two torn halves, Daniel Reyes felt something inside his chest tear right along with it. If you have ever watched someone destroy the one thing you worked, bled, and sacrificed everything to protect, stay with me until the end. Because what happened next inside that glass tower changed more lives than anyone in that boardroom could have imagined. And if stories about ordinary people who refuse to give up, even when the world humiliates them, mean something to you, do me a favor right now. Hit that like button and subscribe, because this channel exists for exactly this kind of story, and you will not want to miss what comes next. Daniel Reyes was 38 years old, and for the last 11 of those years, flying had been the only thing standing between him and complete collapse. He was a charter pilot, the kind who flew small jets for private clients, medical transports, and the occasional cargo run for companies that needed something moved fast and quietly. He was good at his job, methodical, calm under pressure, the kind of man who checked every gauge twice, not because he doubted himself, but because he had a 6-year-old daughter named Mia waiting for him at home, and he had promised himself, that he would always come back. Mia's mother had left when Mia was 2. Daniel did not like to talk about it much, not because it still broke him, though some nights it did, but because dwelling on it never once helped him pay a bill or braid his daughter's hair for school. He raised her mostly alone, with occasional help from his sister Carla, who lived 20 minutes away and who had more than once shown up at 2 in the morning when Daniel was stuck on a delayed flight and Mia had a fever. Daniel's apartment was small, the kind of small where you could hear the refrigerator hum from every room, but it was clean and it was warm and it was theirs. On the morning this story truly begins, Daniel had been called in for an unusual assignment. His boss at Skyline Air Charter, a wiry, nervous man named Frank Dobbins, told him that a courier company needed a pilot to fly a single sealed envelope from a small regional airfield 200 miles away directly to the private helipad atop Halden Tower, headquarters of Halden Industries, one of the largest logistics and manufacturing conglomerates in the country. The envelope, Frank said, was marked urgent, time-sensitive, and confidential, and the client was willing to pay triple the normal rate to have it delivered by hand by a licensed pilot within 4 hours. Daniel did not ask too many questions. In his line of work, plenty of packages moved without explanation, and as long as it was legal, and Frank swore up and down that it was, he did not need to know more than that. A woman named Evelyn Cho, an independent auditor who had been reviewing safety records for one of Halden Industries' subsidiary manufacturing plants, needed a report delivered directly into the hands of the CEO before an emergency board meeting at 11 that morning. Evelyn Cho, exhausted and pale when Daniel met her briefly on the tarmac, handed him the envelope with both hands, the way you might hand someone a sleeping child. "This has to get to Marcus Halden personally," she told him, her voice tight. "Not his assistant, not his lawyer, him. Please. People could get hurt if this sits in a drawer for even one more day." Daniel promised her he would deliver it himself, and he meant it the way he meant every promise he made, fully, without reservation. He flew the 200 miles with the envelope secured in a small lock case beside him, landed on the helipad atop Halden Tower with 11 minutes to spare, and was met by a security escort who walked him briskly through a corridor of glass and steel into an executive floor that smelled like money and air conditioning. He had never been inside a place like Halden Tower before. The floors were polished to a mirror shine, the walls hung with abstract art that probably cost more than his apartment, and every person he passed moved with the clipped, purposeful walk of people who had somewhere important to be. Daniel, still in his slightly rumpled pilot's uniform, dark navy with the Skyline air patch on the shoulder, felt distinctly out of place. But he kept his shoulders back and his eyes forward, because Mia was watching a version of him in his mind, and that version did not shrink. He was led into a boardroom where perhaps a dozen executives sat around a long table of dark wood, and at the head of that table sat Marcus Halden himself. Daniel recognized him instantly from magazine covers. A tall man in his 50s with silver hair combed back and a suit that fit him the way suits only fit men who had never once worried about the price of anything. Marcus Halden had a reputation. Daniel knew vaguely for being brilliant, ruthless, and almost never present in the day-to-day operations of his own company, preferring instead to delegate to a small circle of trusted lieutenants while he attended conferences and cultivated his public image as a visionary. Daniel approached the table, introduced himself briefly, and extended the envelope. "Mr. Halden, I have an urgent delivery from Evelyn Cho regarding the safety audit at your Meridian Falls plant. She asked that it be placed directly in your hands." The room went very quiet. A woman to Halden's left, sharp-suited with a severe bob haircut, whom Daniel would later learn was Chief Operating Officer Renata Voss, stiffened visibly. Marcus Halden did not reach for the envelope right away. He looked at it the way a man looks at a bill he has no intention of paying, then glanced at Renata Voss, some silent communication passing between them that Daniel could not decode but could absolutely feel. Finally, Halden took the envelope from Daniel's hands, and Daniel felt a flicker of relief, thinking his job was done, thinking Evelyn Cho's exhausted, frightened face back on that tarmac would finally get its resolution. But instead of opening it, instead of even breaking the seal, Marcus Halden looked directly at Daniel, and with a small, cold smile that never touched his eyes, he tore the envelope in half. Then in half again. He did it slowly, deliberately, the way a man performs an action specifically because he wants an audience to understand exactly what he thinks of them, and he let the torn pieces fall onto the polished marble floor at Daniel's feet. "Tell whoever sent you," Halden said, his voice smooth and unbothered, "that Halden Industries does not respond to threats disguised as concern. And tell your little auditor friend that if she wants to keep working in this industry, she should learn which doors not to knock on." The boardroom erupted into scattered, uncomfortable laughter. The kind people offer when they are relieved someone else is being humiliated instead of them. Daniel stood there for a moment, feeling something hot rise in his throat. Not quite anger. Something closer to grief. Grief for Evelyn Cho's trembling hands on that tarmac. Grief for whatever those torn pages had contained. Grief for the plain unfairness of watching someone with everything casually destroy something that might have mattered enormously to someone with nothing. He wanted to say something. He wanted to pick up the shredded pages and demand to know what was in them. Demand to know why a grown man in a $2,000 suit felt the need to humiliate a courier who was only doing his job. But he had a daughter at home, and he had learned a long time ago that dignity sometimes means walking away instead of making a scene. So he simply said, "I'll pass along your message." Turned and walked out of that boardroom with his back straight and his hand steady, even though inside he felt like he had swallowed glass. What Daniel did not know, what almost no one in that boardroom knew, was that at the far end of the long table, seated quietly, almost invisibly, in a plain gray suit with no tie, sat a man named Julian Kessler. Julian was 61 years old, and he was, by several independent estimates, one of the wealthiest men in the country. Though he rarely appeared in public and almost never allowed his photograph to be taken at industry events. Julian Kessler was there that morning, not as a member of Halden Industries leadership, but as a silent observer representing Kessler Capital Partners, the private investment firm that, through a complex web of holding companies, owned a controlling 41% stake in Halden Industries. Marcus Halden ran the company day to day, but Julian Kessler was, in every way that mattered on paper, his boss. Julian had come to that meeting to observe quarterly performance reviews, expecting a routine morning of spreadsheets and projections. He had not expected to watch a company he partially owned tear up an urgent safety document delivered by hand in front of a room full of witnesses without so much as reading a single word of it. Julian Kessler had built his fortune not through luck, but through an almost obsessive attention to detail, a habit of noticing the things other people dismissed as unimportant. And as he watched Daniel Reyes walk out of that boardroom with his dignity intact and his jaw clenched, Julian felt a very specific, very familiar sensation, the sensation of something being deeply, dangerously wrong beneath the polished surface of a company's public face. He said nothing in the meeting. He let the quarterly reports proceed, but the moment the meeting adjourned, Julian quietly instructed his personal assistant, a sharp young woman named Priya Nair, who had worked for him for 6 years and understood that his quiet requests were never actually optional, to find out everything she could about Evelyn Cho, the Meridian Falls plant, and the pilot who had delivered that envelope. Daniel, meanwhile, flew back to the small regional airfield in a fog of frustration. He called Frank Dobbins to report that the delivery had technically been completed, though the client had reacted with hostility. And Frank, sensing something off in Daniel's voice, told him to just get the plane refueled and head home, that they would sort out payment details later. Daniel found Evelyn Cho waiting near the hangar, wringing her hands, and when he told her what had happened, when he described Marcus Halden tearing the report in half without reading it, Evelyn's face went from hopeful to devastated in the span of a few seconds. She sat down hard on a nearby bench and put her head in her hands. "That report," she said quietly, "documented 3 safety violations at the Meridian Falls plant that could cause a catastrophic equipment failure. I flagged them 8 weeks ago through internal channels and got ignored. I flagged them again 4 weeks ago and got told to stop making noise. This was my last attempt to get it in front of someone who could actually stop it before someone gets hurt." She looked up at Daniel, her eyes red. "There are 200 people working 3 shifts in that plant. I don't know what else I can do." Daniel sat down beside her, and for a long moment neither of them said anything. He thought about the way Marcus Halden had smiled while destroying that report, the ease of a man who had never once had to consider the weight of consequences falling on someone else's shoulders. He thought about his own job, about the mechanics who serviced his aircraft, about how seriously he took every warning light, every unusual vibration, because ignoring one small thing in aviation could cost lives, and he could not imagine dismissing a documented safety hazard with a smirk and a flourish. He told Evelyn that he did not know what more either of them could do that day, but that giving up before people actually got hurt did not sit right with him either, and if she needed a witness to what happened in that boardroom, he would give a statement, sign anything, testify if it came to that. It was 2 days later, on a quiet Thursday evening, when Daniel's phone rang from an unfamiliar number as he was helping Mia with a puzzle on the living room floor. The voice on the other end introduced herself as Priya Nair, calling on behalf of Julian Kessler, and asked whether Daniel would be available to meet Mr. Kessler personally the following morning. Daniel, confused and mildly suspicious, asked what this was regarding. And Priya said only that Mr. Kessler had witnessed something in a boardroom 2 days earlier that he could not stop thinking about, and that he wanted to speak with the pilot who had delivered that envelope. Daniel almost said no. He had Mia to think about. And something about being summoned by an unfamiliar billionaire's assistant felt like the setup to either a scam or a very strange fever dream. But Carla, when he called her to ask if she could watch Mia the next morning, told him bluntly that he would regret it forever if he did not at least find out what this was about. And so the next morning, wearing his one good collared shirt instead of his uniform, Daniel found himself in a modest, almost unassuming office on the 40th floor of a building 3 blocks from Halden Tower, sitting across from Julian Kessler. Julian Kessler was nothing like Marcus Halden. He wore no tie, his suit was plain, his office contained no ostentatious art, only bookshelves, crammed with well-worn books and a single-frame photograph of a woman Daniel would later learn was Julian's late wife, who had died of an illness that Julian mentioned only once and briefly, could have been caught earlier if a company he had once trusted had not cut corners on employee health screenings to save money. Julian asked Daniel, without any preamble, to describe exactly what he had seen and heard in that boardroom, word for word, if he could remember it. Daniel did remember it, every second of it, because moments of injustice tend to burn themselves into memory more permanently than moments of comfort ever do. And he recounted the entire scene in detail. Marcus Halden's smile, the torn pages falling to the marble floor, the scattered laughter, the comment about Evelyn Cho learning which doors not to knock on. Julian listened without interrupting, his fingers steepled in front of him, his expression unreadable until Daniel finished, at which point he exhaled slowly and said, "I own 41% of that company, Mr. Reyes. I have sat in dozens of meetings with Marcus Halden over the years and told myself that his abrasiveness was simply the price of his results. I was wrong to look away as long as I did. Thank you for telling me the truth plainly, without softening it to make the room more comfortable. Most people, when speaking to someone with my kind of money, instinctively soften things. You didn't." Daniel told him he did not know how to speak to someone with that kind of money, so he had simply spoken like himself, and Julian actually laughed at that, a short, genuine sound that seemed to surprise even him. Then Julian's expression turned serious again, and he told Daniel that Priya had already tracked down Evelyn Cho's original report through backup records, the auditing firm was required to retain, that he had read every page of it the previous night, and that what it described was worse than he had feared: aging pressure valves at the Meridian Falls plant that had already failed, a preliminary inspection, patchwork repairs instead of full replacements to save on quarterly costs, and internal emails, which Evelyn had included as evidence, showing that at least 2 plant managers had explicitly raised concerns that were overruled by corporate leadership under Renata Voss's direction, all while Marcus Halden was kept informed and chose inaction because a full valve replacement across the plant would have cost several $millions and delayed a shareholder dividend announcement he had been counting on to boost his personal reputation before an industry award ceremony. Julian told Daniel that he intended to call an emergency meeting of the board of directors, using his controlling stake to force an independent safety review of the Meridian Falls plant within 48 hours, and that he wanted Daniel and Evelyn Cho both present, not as background witnesses, but as the people whose integrity had actually surfaced the truth. Daniel asked, somewhat bewildered, why Julian needed him there at all, since he was just the pilot, just the delivery man in this whole story. And Julian looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Because everyone in that boardroom 2 days ago had a choice," Julian said. "Renata Voss chose silence. The board members who laughed chose comfort. Marcus Halden chose cruelty because he assumed no one with real power would ever bother to check. You chose to stand there, deliver an uncomfortable truth to a room full of powerful people, and walk out with your dignity instead of groveling or arguing. That kind of character is rarer than money, Mr. Reyes, and I intend to make sure it is not wasted on a room that failed to notice it." 2 days later, Daniel found himself back inside Halden Tower, this time in a different, smaller conference room alongside Evelyn Cho, Julian Kessler, Priya Nair, and, filing in with visible confusion and mounting alarm, Marcus Halden and Renata Voss, along with the full board of directors. Julian Kessler, for the first time in years, according to whispered comments Daniel overheard among the junior staff, was chairing the meeting personally instead of sitting silently at the end of the table. Julian did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He simply had copies of Evelyn Cho's full report distributed to every person at the table, along with the internal emails showing exactly who had known what and when, and he asked Marcus Halden, calmly and directly, to explain to the board why he had torn up a documented safety hazard report in front of witnesses, rather than reading a single page of it. Marcus Halden, whose confidence had visibly evaporated the moment he saw the familiar blue folder on the table, tried to explain that he had been dealing with what he believed was an attempt at extortion disguised as an audit, that couriers showed up with alarmist documents all the time, that he had acted on instinct to protect the company from what he assumed was a manipulative tactic. Julian let him finish, then asked a single question that seemed to hang in the room like smoke. Did you at any point consider that you might simply be wrong, and that the fastest way to find out would have been to read the 4 pages in that envelope before destroying them? Marcus Halden had no good answer, because there was no good answer. The board, most of whom had laughed along in that first meeting, now sat in uncomfortable silence, several of them visibly recalculating how complicit their own laughter had made them. Renata Voss attempted to shift blame toward plant management, but Julian, having done his homework thoroughly, produced her own email explicitly overruling a plant manager's request for an emergency valve inspection 6 weeks earlier, citing quarterly budget targets. By the end of that meeting, the board voted, under Julian's controlling influence and the mounting fear of personal liability, to immediately shut down and inspect the Meridian Falls plant, to fund full valve replacements rather than patchwork repairs, and to place Marcus Halden on administrative leave pending a full independent investigation into his handling of internal safety concerns. Renata Voss resigned before the investigation concluded. The independent inspection, completed within the week, confirmed that at least one of the pressure valves Evelyn Cho had flagged was within days, possibly hours, of catastrophic failure. A failure that safety engineers later confirmed could have caused an explosion capable of injuring or killing dozens of workers on the plant floor. Evelyn Cho, whose career had been quietly threatened and whose warnings had been dismissed for 2 months, was publicly credited by the board for her diligence, and Julian Kessler personally ensured that her auditing firm was retained on a long-term contract with significantly expanded authority to flag safety concerns directly to the board rather than through management channels that could bury inconvenient truths. As for Daniel, Julian Kessler did something Daniel never expected. He did not offer him a large check and send him on his way, though he did ensure Skyline Air Charter was paid handsomely and fairly for the delivery, and separately ensured Frank Dobbins received a note of appreciation for employing pilots of Daniel's caliber. Instead, Julian offered Daniel a position, an unusual one, as a kind of independent verification liaison within Kessler Capital Partners, someone who would personally deliver and verify the receipt of sensitive documents across Julian's various portfolio companies, with the explicit authority to report directly to Julian himself if anything similar to what happened at Halden Tower ever occurred again. The salary alone was nearly triple what Daniel earned as a charter pilot. But more than the money, Julian told him plainly that he wanted someone in that role who could not be intimidated by titles or marble floors. Someone who understood that dignity and honesty were not negotiable simply because the person across the table had more money in their bank account. Daniel thought about it for exactly 1 night. He thought about Mia, about the extra security this would give her, about being able to say yes to things he had always had to say no to. Dance classes, a better school district, a vacation that was not just camping 30 minutes from home. But more than any of that, he thought about the version of himself that had walked out of that boardroom 2 weeks earlier with his back straight, refusing to let humiliation make him smaller than he actually was. And he realized that Julian was not simply offering him a job, he was offering him a life where that version of himself, steady, principled, unwilling to be diminished, would finally be seen and valued instead of dismissed. He said yes. 6 months later, Daniel stood on a small stage at an aviation safety conference, invited as a guest speaker alongside Evelyn Cho, to talk about the importance of taking safety reports seriously, regardless of who delivers them or how inconvenient the timing might be. Mia sat in the front row, swinging her feet, wearing a small paper airplane pin Daniel had bought her at the airport gift shop years earlier, one she wore to every event that mattered to her father. When Daniel finished speaking, he looked out at the room and thought about that torn envelope, about the two pieces of paper falling onto marble floor, and about how close an entire plant full of workers had come to catastrophe simply because one powerful man assumed that cruelty and dismissal were free actions with no consequences. They were not free. They never are. Somewhere, someone is always watching, even when you assume no one important is paying attention, even when the person watching sits quietly at the end of a long table saying nothing at all. Marcus Halden learned that lesson at the cost of his career and his reputation. Daniel Reyes learned a different lesson entirely, that carrying yourself with integrity in a room designed to make you feel small is never wasted, even when it feels, in the moment, like it changes absolutely nothing. Julian Kessler, for his part, kept a single item on his office shelf from that entire ordeal. Not a plaque, not a photograph, but the two torn halves of Evelyn Cho's original report, carefully taped back together and framed. A quiet reminder to himself and to every executive who ever walked into his office that the smallest, most inconvenient piece of paper handed to you by the least powerful person in the room might be the only thing standing between comfort and catastrophe. And that the true measure of character was never how you treated the people who could reward you, but how you treated the people who could not. Daniel still flies sometimes, on weekends, just for himself and Mia. Small, quiet flights over the coastline where nobody needs anything urgent delivered and no one is waiting to tear anything apart. Up there, engine humming steady beneath them, his daughter's small hand resting on the yoke beside his own, Daniel Reyes finally understood what it felt like to be exactly where he belonged, not because a billionaire had noticed him, but because he had never once stopped being the kind of man worth noticing in the first place. In the years that followed, Daniel liked to say that the hardest part of the entire ordeal was never the boardroom, never Marcus Halden's cold smile, never even the fear of losing his job for speaking plainly to a man worth billions. The hardest part had been the quiet drive home the night of that first humiliation, sitting at a red light with the torn envelope still replaying in his mind, wondering whether doing the right thing had actually accomplished anything at all. He had almost convinced himself, somewhere around that intersection, that showing up, telling the truth, and refusing to grovel simply did not matter in a world built for people like Marcus Halden. It would have been easy to let that thought win. Plenty of good, tired, overworked people let exactly that thought win every single day, and nobody blames them for it. Because cynicism is often just exhaustion, wearing a more respectable coat. But Daniel kept driving that night, and he picked Mia up from Carla's apartment, and she ran to him the way she always did, arms out, completely unaware that her father had just watched a man tear apart someone's desperate attempt to prevent a tragedy. She asked him how his day was, the way 6-year-olds do, expecting a simple answer. And Daniel told her truthfully that it had been a hard day, but that he had tried his best to do the right thing anyway. Mia had nodded solemnly, the way children do when they sense something important without fully understanding it, and said, "That's what you always tell me to do, Dad, even when it's hard." In that small apartment kitchen, reheating leftover pasta, while his daughter narrated an elaborate story about her stuffed rabbit's imaginary adventures, Daniel had no idea that a billionaire sitting quietly at the end of a long boardroom table had already begun asking questions that would change both their lives. He only knew that he had kept his promise to himself, and for that one night, exhausted and uncertain, that had to be enough. Looking back on it now, whenever Daniel tells this story to new pilots, he mentors through the aviation safety program he helped establish with Julian's backing. He always ends with the same piece of advice. You rarely get to see, in the moment, who is watching or what your small act of integrity will eventually set in motion. Most days, doing the right thing will feel like it changes nothing at all. You will drive home in silence, replaying the humiliation, wondering if it was worth it. But somewhere, sometimes, someone is paying closer attention than you could ever imagine. And the version of yourself you protect in those quiet, unglamorous moments is exactly the version that ends up mattering most when it counts. If this story moved you even a little, if you believe that quiet integrity deserves to win more often than it does in real life, let us know in the comments. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that doing the right thing still matters. And subscribe for more stories like this one, because there are so many more Daniels out there, and they all deserve to have their moment too.